Welcome to episode 8. Do you want to have better results from your interviews with subject matter experts and top performers? Well, let's get right into it because I'm about to help.
You're here because you want more engagement, more delight, more fun, more learning. You're hungry for change and willing to take action.
If you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original.
Welcome to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Let's take learning to the next level.
Well, hello there, and thank you so much for joining me today. I hope your day is going fabulous, and if it's not, then by the end of this podcast, it's going to be fabulous. I guarantee it. Okay, so what I wanted to talk to you about today is one of my most favoritist subjects, which is subject matter expert SME interviews. And what I did is I found this really rockin' article that's put together by basically top journalists on how to create better interviews. And I thought, this is interesting because I feel like a lot of us get our advice on how to run a really good interview with a subject matter expert from a journalistic perspective. And so there's certain things that you want to do differently when you're talking to a subject matter expert because your intent is different. And therefore, the way that you prepare for that conversation and how you talk during that conversation is, or the questions you're going to ask, it's going to have a big impact on the kind of output you're going to get. And I know that some of the frustrations that I would experience is, having a conversation with somebody whose time is tight and then getting this transcript back and going, oh my gosh, I can't use any of this. None of this is helpful. It's just a bunch of stuff that was a little bit of an elaboration on the actual maybe manual, but this person isn't really giving me what I need to actually create great scenarios. Have you been there? I've been there like so many times. So what I thought about is that I would actually deconstruct this article, maybe break down some of those practices that aren't helpful to help you design great scenarios and help you apply some strategies that have helped me get more efficient and also more effective at getting the kinds of stories and resources that actually help me create compelling content that is scenario driven. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the idea that the intent of your meeting with a subject matter expert is different than why a journalist would be getting together with, let's say, a celebrity or anybody. It doesn't have to be a celebrity. So their intents are different as well, depending on who they're interviewing, right? But I think the main difference is that when we're interviewing, let's say a journalist is interviewing somebody, the end result is that they're going to create a piece about them. Or they're a source of information and they're in effect being featured as a source of that information. Now, the difference with the interviews that we do with our subject matter experts is that they're not going to be featured as experts. We're using them to extract information about a specific topic that will help us make better learning. And there is a certain amount, I'm sure, of anxiety that somebody feels when we're making these resources, when we're interviewing a subject matter expert. They might feel like, one, we're basically stealing their IP, intellectual property, and we're now going to make them obsolete because we're basically taking what they perceive as their only value and now packaging it up in a scenario module, right? And I can understand that completely. And so one of the things that I suggest you do is walk in, or even when you're setting up the conversations with that person, I think one of the things we have to stress is that definitely the subject matter expertise is going to be pulled out, but it is not going to be the factual pieces that are going to be relevant to you. It is going to be, when I say factual, I mean like the manual type stuff and the information, because that can be found. And a lot of people don't realize that if they think that their only contribution to a role is through their contextual or their factual expertise, is that they're already obsolete, because all of that is on the internet somewhere, or an intranet someplace. So that's not where they add the value. Where they add value is to be able to share stories that are contextual and find and be able to actually give you the kind of perspective that one can only gain through experience. And what I mean by that is that scenarios, when we design them, sometimes the consequences that we build into our scenarios are very much a reflection of time compressed. So, for example, let's say somebody does something today, like they don't close a latch on a box, and they do that today. But let's say 6 months from now, that latch opens and a bunch of hammers falls out on somebody. Now, the person who maybe didn't close the latch couldn't make that connection because they were now off the job site and somebody else got hurt, and this never made a connection to them. But what you can do in the scenario is take those consequences and make them very evident, because you can compress time and say 6 months later, boom, look, you just killed somebody. I'm always into the drama killing stuff, but it's like consequences are consequences. So, and you'll be glad to know I have my tea ready, by the way. My favorite tea is, I can't get away from it, is still Earl Grey. Sometimes it's Lady Grey tea. Once in a while, it's hard to find good stuff, but I've tried all kinds of different Earl Greys with all this chocolate and vanilla, and I'm like, no, that's wrong. I can't handle it. Anyways, I digress. So here's the thing. I think that's kind of cool about somebody who has experience, has been watching the process over time, or has been in the process over time. I want to stress that, because I think, well, that's another conversation, but they're able to see, or through their experience, they're actually able to tell you not just the immediate consequences, but the consequences over time. And those are things that you can't usually get from a manual. Or like, let's say the manual will say, you should be making this latch, you should be closing this latch because it's a safety issue. And it's kind of like the idea behind, smoking cigarettes. If they gave you cancer like the next day that you started smoking, then what would happen is everybody would just not smoke anymore, right? But because the effects are so embedded in with your, they manifest so late, that what happens is people tend to ignore them, right? And so that's what, a good scenario will compress that time and make it evident, which I think would actually probably make a really good, a good module. Although consequences alone are not what's going to make the change. However, you get my drift. So now let's go back to motivations of the interview, right? We talked about the fact that the SME might feel a little bit like you're stealing their intellectual property. They might also be, intimidated by the fact that they're a source of information for you. Some people are not confident giving information because they either want to make sure that it is accurate, and they might feel like they don't get to control the final output, so that might misrepresent what they said. So those are all real fears, and they're extremely natural fears, and do not ignore them. Because we are all human, we all have agendas, we all have, goals. And if you walk into that meeting and you haven't taken the time to really think about how you're going to address these concerns and how you're going to, just get them out of the way right away, your interview will not be as effective. And one of the things I want you to maybe think about is, I hear this a lot where people say, oh, you have to be, you have to create a relationship with your subject matter expert. And I actually don't agree with that. You don't have to be friends with that person. Your relationship could be, and I guess this is, if you call this a relationship, it can be a purely professional, transactional situation. These people are very busy. I don't think they want to spend way more time with you than necessary. And so I think if you can be almost like let's say, picture yourself as the Oprah of, the Oprah of e-learning, where you create rapport and you create a comfort with somebody without, Oprah doesn't need to hang out with all of her guests. I mean, that would be ridiculous, right? But for some reason, people feel very comfortable telling her a lot of very personal stuff. I mean, definitely she's got some street credibility there, but maybe that's something you want to build out, is some sort of credibility where you work, that you are the kind of person that people enjoy working with, and you are a very credible professional in this area, and you respect their time and you respect their ideas. So, so what I was getting at is basically the fact that you need to get into these situations where you're interviewing the SME, where you're not thinking about yourself very much. You're really thinking about them and being very honest about what those expectations are. So when I say that, I mean things like, you're going to tell the subject matter expert or the top performer how you're going to use this information. You don't have to show them what you're building. Thus, actually, to me, that's overwhelm. What you can do is actually just let them know that even on a piece of paper, what you're trying to accomplish. Let them know that you will, once you draft something very quickly, you'll probably require them, because they are the expert, to let you know if the things you drew, the conclusions you drew about the scenarios you're going to design, that if they're accurate and contextual, if they make sense, if they're credible. And so I think a lot of times here, it is the language that you use that will influence somebody to really, and I did mean the word influence when I said it, they'll become the kind of person that wants to help you. And it's kind of funny, because one of the things that I think we forget is that people can be influenced through goodwill. So it's not necessarily just giving somebody compliments that they are the best, and the reason you're talking to them is because they have been selected as the expert. It's also coming in with a gift. And when I say a gift, I mean a coffee, cookie, something, because I know this is kind of feels weird, but the minute you give somebody something, a gift, they kind of feel a little bit, there's the law of reciprocity, and that's just a float plane going by. The law of reciprocity is at that point activated, and those people will want to help you a little bit more if they were resistant before that, because you gave them a gift. So do not underestimate what that's like. And a lot of times, I'll see people coming into meetings, they'll just have a coffee for themselves. It doesn't matter if you don't want, if you don't know if the other person drinks coffee, just the act of bringing them a cup of coffee, assuming, that they also want cream and sugar, you bring that. Those are things that kind of detail makes a huge difference. So do not forget that, because that's like a $2, expenditure on your part, but it is something that they see in their eyes as a gift, and they'll want to reciprocate. So, okay. So moving on to the first set of advice, if that's a word. Is that advices? No. First set of advice that this article said, and one of them is, and that's a coffee grinder, by the way, that you can hear right now. That always seems to happen when I'm doing my my podcast. Somebody somewhere always grinding coffee. All right. So one of them is do more homework. And it says, my only true advice for anyone carrying out an interview is to embrace the Boy Scouts motto, be prepared. Now, And the premise behind this suggestion from a journalist is that the people who are being interviewed, it's funny, they're also reluctant to give up good info. They'll give you, general statements. They'll hide things because they don't want to get personal, right? Personal things are what we want, but personal things are what people want to hide because they're personal. So the idea is that the more you prepare and the more you know about somebody's background, the more respect you're going to get and the more they're going to open up and give you everything you want. And that's great if you're a journalist. It's not scalable and not a good strategy, actually, if you're an instructional designer. And the reason for that is there's multiple reasons, so bear with me here. So you don't want to become the expert because then you start pretending you know the answers to some of the questions. Like one of the things that happens is when you overlearn something, like when you come into a meeting and you've like read the whole manual, somebody starts telling you something, you're like, oh, okay, because you read it or because you know it, you might be one of those, you probably are one of those people that like loves to learn and you'll read everything about a topic. You'll stop asking questions about why something works a certain way. The idea is that I feel like when you enter an interview, and this is what I do, I try to keep just the mind of a baby. And the mind of a baby is, let's say a 2-year-old, extremely curious, extremely open-minded. Whatever you present, they're like, oh, okay. There's no presuppositions about what something is, which is beautiful because then you can ask a lot of great questions. The minute you start learning about a topic too much, you start making assumptions and you fill in the voids in your own mind before asking a lot of whys. So the idea here is not your goal to impress a subject matter expert with how much research you've done because they're the subject matter expert. Your goal is to become represent the learner. What are some situations that I should know about as a novice employee or as a seasoned employee who's already been working but needs to relearn something? What are those mental models that I need to be aware of that mess things up, right? Those are hard to discover, but I guarantee you'll discover that you'll be less likely to discover them if you walk into all those meetings trying to be just as good as the expert. And also, I feel that when somebody hands you a big book and they're like, okay, here it is, and then come prepared to the meeting for the subject matter expert, and you just read the whole manual. One, the manual does not represent reality most times, from what I've learned. Everything is a shade of gray. Also, for you to be... It's just not a good state of humbleness if you think you can walk into a meeting reading something over and have the same kind of expertise. And then now, you might think that you don't even need the subject matter expert. Never, ever, ever make that assumption. So it's really cool to walk in there like a baby. Pretend you're a baby. Now, the pushback that I've heard from this is mostly people saying, hey, I don't want to look like a fool in that meeting. Listen, you're not the subject matter expert. You're not going to be the fool. I feel like sometimes, yes, people are like, don't you know this? And yeah, that comes across to me. But then what happens is, at first they're a little bit, there's sometimes where people have been flustered saying, well, how come you don't know this? Why are you interviewing me? And that's a very fair question. However, I'll say, you are the expert, and I want to maintain the novice mind, so I don't make any assumptions. So and I start off every interview saying, I'm probably gonna ask you a lot of questions that you think are terribly silly. And then I tell them about the curse of knowledge. And I tell them about the fact that, and this is also like quite a bit of acknowledging that they are the expert and I really, really, really need their help, what happens is for them, a lot of these things are now second nature. But for the person who's learning them for the first time, that's that person's like fourth language. And so what I'm trying to do is discover all the steps it took for them to make it their first language. And that's why my questions might seem silly, because they seem so like like they're kind of like common knowledge or common sense, but they're now common sense to them because the subject matter expert, this is now their first language, and I want to always keep it as my second, third, and fourth language, which means that I'm always deconstructing the steps that you need to take in order to get to that level. So I preamble it, and then I feel like a lot of times they're not used to being grilled the way that I grill them, but after a while they start getting used to it and they start figuring out that I am not kidding around. Like I really am at one no, and that curiosity comes through and the humbleness comes through, and most people really really work well with that. I've only had once where somebody said, well, I don't know why you're asking me all these questions. And I think it's just because they didn't understand that learning is not just giving somebody a bunch of information, that learning is a scaffolding of skills and attitudes and knowledge, all those things combined together, and you need to unpack that. And so I think this person was almost, in some cases, let's be honest, there will be people who are so much of an expert that they will not be able to help you because they are just too far removed from the actual learning process. In some cases, they're so much of an expert that they've stopped learning. And to me, that person is no longer valuable to me. I need to talk to somebody else. So you also have to be aware for that. And I mean, even the journalist article says that sometimes, regardless of how well prepared you are for an interview, some of them will suck and some of them never get published. So if that happens to a journalist, it can happen to you. So be okay with it and just realize that maybe sometimes you need more choices and maybe ask for somebody else or another person because you need more depth or whatever it is. So step number 1, do not make assumptions about the content and do not overlearn it at all because it doesn't help you design better learning because you stop asking the really silly questions that help make great learning happen. This is a really good piece of advice, and I feel like I already touched on it a little bit. The tip is to put your subject at ease. And here's what it says. Regardless of whether your subject is well known or not, the person answering questions is probably nervous. If you want them to open up, you have to put them at ease. Start by getting your own nerves under control. People mirror the interviewer's behavior. Marchese said. This is a person who contributed. If you're nervous and uptight, there's a good chance the other person will feel less comfortable. If you're relaxed, open, upbeat, and curious, the person you're talking to will mirror that. And another way of making your subject comfortable is to share something relatable about yourself. See, that's kind of cool because I feel like these are those little tips that you can use to create instant rapport with people without having to spend months getting to know them and becoming best friends and spending lunch hours with them, because we don't have time for that. And sometimes you don't want to, right? Like realistically, especially if you're a busy instructional designer and multimedia developer, my goodness, everybody has just so little time. You want to make sure that these meetings are efficient, but that you have almost like this right little toolkit in place so that you can spend, like a Pixar movie, the first 11 minutes, let's say, creating some deep, deep rapport with that person. And that happens through that respect, reciprocity, as I said. Buy them a gift, buy them a cup of coffee. I'm not saying gift. I'm saying something like a good gesture of goodwill. And then here, put yourself in a mental state that is calm and warm and humble and curious, because the minute you walk in with that aura, it's contagious. And one of the things that I always recommend, because a lot of us work remotely, including myself, is that whenever you're talking with people via Skype or Zoom or WebEx, whichever virtual platform you use, always, always, always put your video on. And the reason I say this is that we are, underneath it all, beasts. We are creatures that are social. We are creatures that recognize cues through the way people's eyes move, small expressions that we make, the flush of our skin, all those things. And so when you remove that from a conversation, you lose probably 70% of trust from someone. So the only way I've ran conversations where I'm just on a phone with somebody is if somebody else who knows that person is also on the phone. So they already have a rapport, and then I can be brought in, and that kind of ups my rapport credibility with them. But otherwise, if you're starting from cold, it's so hard, and they're probably not going to tell you anything really personal unless, both of you are like super, those like super connector people. And once in a while, I'm in that mood. And if I talk to somebody, like I've had several podcasts where I just talk to people via like Skype without video, and I'll talk to them and it'll just be like instant rapport. But that is very rare. And if you're not already in that zone, and the person who is, usually people who interview you are already in that zone. If you're not in that zone with your SME, it's not going to help if you don't have your faces on each other. So even if you don't have your subject matter expert's face on, you should always have your video on because they can see your expression. Ask if they can see you, and then be completely genuine and and talking to actually make eye contact with the camera. But the fact that they can see you just alone increases their ability to trust you because they can see you're another human being. I know that sounds weird, but it makes a huge difference. I would never skip that step if you actually want to get really good info from somebody. Okay, so this is kind of interesting too. I really like this tip that they had: prioritize conversation. So if you've ever listened to a speaker read off notes during a presentation, you know how lifeless that experience can be. And the same applies for interviews. Rather than rattling off your list of questions, focus on having a conversation. So one way of doing this is to take the time to learn your questions. Throughout the research process, this person's taking notes. And they say that they're taking notes, and then what they do is they try to memorize the questions by reading over their notes. That's kind of a confusing process here. Okay. Oh, when he's doing his research, he's writing down all the notes about what he's going to ask, and then he reads it out loud to himself about 20 or 30 times so he can memorize the questions. Now, this is what's beautiful about being an instructional designer. I'm going to give you such an awesome hack. So, the thing is, you're designing e-learning scenarios. So your product, and it is a product, is not going to really become hugely varied. Like basically, if I said, what are the elements of a scenario, you probably could, in your mind, come up with 3 or 4 elements. And hopefully there's something like the setup, the question, the options, and the consequences, and feedback if necessary, if your consequences aren't explicit enough or you need to elaborate on them, whatever, right? So there's those pieces. So when I'm doing an interview with a subject matter expert, I really am focusing on pulling out the situations, the options that somebody would be faced, the decision that they'd have to make. What are some options for that decision? What are some good and bad options? What are the consequences of those decisions? And how, what kind of feedback should they get to improve their thinking and decision making in the future? So your questions are very much streamlined to have them tell you a story and a situation that will work for that context. It does not change very much. You don't have to remember historical pieces. You don't have to remember what kind of movies this person was in. You don't have to remember any of those things. And what I really like is if I'm ever lost or if I'm not clear on something, I always default with why. And you can ask why lots of times and get a lot of info with just why. One of the things that I found with why is that it's scary to ask that because everybody's like, well, you're admitting that you don't know something, but that's okay. I just said drop all egos at the door because your goal is to make the best possible experience for for that learner. So you're going to find out all the dirty details and you don't care how silly they are, right? So you're going to ask a lot of whys. So why is my default question always? Same. Another one that I like to put is sometimes people will tell you this is really important for them to know. And I'll say things like, okay, so how would this person use it on the job? How would this person use it in their life? Or why would it matter to them at this point other than knowing, right? And those are actually very difficult questions for most subject matter experts to answer because they've always just been told this is these are the chapter listings and we're just going to work through them. I'm never going to have to justify their value in the workplace, or I'm never going to have to explain why this is relevant to this particular person. So they may not necessarily be able to answer those questions. And a lot of times I've asked that where somebody's really not clear, they haven't thought about it, they'll never give me an answer that's sufficient. So that's one thing. So I suggest, asking why, how is somebody going to use this? Why is this important to them? And then the other one that's my favorite, and it gets me a lot of good info, is tell me about a time when this happened. Or tell me about a time when you actually experienced this problem. Because let's say one of the problems is this. And it's like, okay, tell me a story about that problem. So I get to know a little bit more of the context around the problem. Maybe imagine some characters that could be. So they start to give me ideas about stories. So ask them for stories. One of the things you'll find when you do ask people for stories or situations is that, once again, they're not ready for this. So your job is to be quiet. Because if I asked you for a story about your mom, you might have, 25 of them. But if you hadn't seen your mom in a while, maybe you might not have as many. Same with your job. Just because they're a subject matter expert doesn't mean that they could easily come up with a situation that had to do with like a specific aspect of that job, because the last time they actually were in it was maybe 5 years ago, right? Which is scary, it's just why you need to talk to top performers as well, because subject matter experts are sometimes just they're not top performers. They're just experts in content. They're not experts in performance. So, like I said, the top questions are why? Why would somebody find this relevant? When would they apply it on the job? And also, tell me a story about a time when this happened. And I was thinking about this the other day, is that if there was a framework that I would apply to this, it would be something like the STAR interview method. And I don't know if you're familiar with this method. It is quite popular in Canada. So whenever you get an interview, the interview personnel ask you to prepare your answers or frame your answers in a STAR format, which is, I think it's STAR. Yes. I haven't done an interview setup for a little while. So it's something like where you identify the situation. Just Google it, okay? But basically you identify a situation, you find out what the task was, what action, STA action you took to resolve it, resolve the situation, and R. What's something, I don't know what R stands for at this point. Never mind. But the idea is that if you design your questions around a framework, you don't have to remember brand new questions all the time. You'll simply be able to refer to this framework that you have and ask questions that relate to it. What was the situation? What were you trying to accomplish? What was the outcome? How did you solve it? So let's say you practice having those questions. Then what happens is during the interview, it feels like less like you're trying to fill in a bunch of worksheets and more that you're simply inquisitive, and the natural conversation flows much better because you're just asking because you know the questions already. So it feels more natural, and it gives you better results. And this is kind of interesting. So the last tip that they have is edit what you can. So once you've done research and conducted the interview, remember that the hardest part is still to come. And I I do agree. Turning a long and possibly meandering conversation into something people want to read. Now, here's the thing. You don't want a meandering conversation. You want a very focused conversation that focuses on the stories, the context, the consequences, the situations, the decision-making, all those things. You are always trying to bring people back to that. And also, I think one of the tips that I would give you that you have to start internalizing is that you cannot write details down and remember them. You will lose the nuance of the story. You will not be able to keep up. So you always, always, always record your conversation. And also, you do not transcribe your own conversations. It is a waste of your time. You are worth more than the time that it takes for you to transcribe a video or an audio. You send it off to a service like rev.com, rev.com, get it done, spend the money, even if it comes out of your own pocket, because guess what? You are more valuable than spending like 6 hours trying to transcribe your own conversations. It's just not. It's like, that's not where your value comes from. That's not where your brain value comes from, okay? They have robots that do that now, so leverage those robots because it is worth it. It's worth your time. Even if the idea is that you get the day off and and you've paid, I don't know, $30-$40 for something to get taken care of, so you don't have to, so you can have that time to think, that's worth it to me. So start thinking of your time that way. So now you've sent it off, it comes back usually within 24 hours or faster. It's beautifully already organized. You can actually choose to have it take out all the ums and ahs. And there will be words where you're like, yeah, that wasn't the word. But you have the audio recording if you're confused. So then what happens is when you get that back, there's a step that I follow or a process that I follow to refine that and, that script and bring it back or turn it into something that then creates a really awesome a resource for me to pull out my ideas for the scenarios. But that's obviously a different step in the process. I just wanted this episode to be about how you get those crucial conversations with the subject matter expert to work for you. And a couple of other ideas I just wanted to share is that I don't think it's fair for us to enter into those conversations being frustrated when somebody else doesn't know what e-learning is or that they don't know what the process works like, because that's your first language. So that's why I think that a lot of times people say, I can't explain the process to the SME. They don't know anything about e-learning. I don't want them to have to learn about my job because I'm the one doing my job. So own your job, own that process. People don't have to understand what you do. People don't have to understand the systems. They don't have to know what great learning is like. That's not their job. Their job is to provide you with the info you need. And the only way they can do that is if you ask better questions. They can't anticipate what you need. You have to ask better questions. You have to get awesome at these interviews because you are ultimately responsible for that product. Even if somebody else isn't giving you the info you need, then you need to go out and find somebody who will. Do not let that SME dictate what your final product's going to be, because in the end, nobody's going to say, who is the SME on this? They're going to look at the final product and say, this sucks, or this is awesome. Nobody's going to say, this was an amazing e-learning project. Who is a SME on that? No, they're not going to do that. They're just going to look at the final product and evaluate their own experience. So you want to make sure all the pieces that are part of that, for you to do the job well, you need to be in charge of that process. And so if you're not getting the info that you want, if somebody's not working with you the way you want, find somebody else who is. Always be reflective, though, about the fact, like, if every single person I talk to, if every single project that I'm having, a subject matter expert, and I'm having difficulty with all those people, what's the common denominator? Is it your approach? Is it something you need to adjust? Is it Is it the way that the interview is presented, set up? Is it the time that it's happening in the year? Is it the culture? So those are all things you have to think about because they all play into the part of your quick interview. If you do this right, then the part that the interview actually takes very little time. It could be, sometimes you can get amazing stuff just by talking to somebody for less than an hour. And then you can start working from there to create some really rockin' prototypes, right? But if you're seeing a struggle consistently, evaluate what are basically the context of all of your conversations. What are you doing to help make sure that all the odds are stacked in your favor? So when you guys get to that 45 minutes of like power conversation and storytelling, story sharing, that all the pieces before that have been kind of set up to when people come into that room, that it's like a great feeling. And the other thing you want to do, of course, is follow up and say, hey, thanks so much. You're off the hook. I'm getting this transcribed. Thank you so much for all the info you shared. If you think of anything else, let me know. In the meantime, you can relax though, because I'm going to go off and try and build a couple of prototypes very quickly. So when you get a chance in the next week, as soon as you get them, just give me some feedback, quick feedback on whether I captured your vision for this the right way. And there's obviously lots more I can share, but I think these are the essentials. And if you can do this, and maybe reflect on this process, figure out what's working for you, why you got more out of one person versus another, look at how you are contributing to that conversation, I think then we can have a way better experience with our subject matter experts. And then we can also be really open-minded about, what the expectations that people have coming into these conversations. So I hope that was helpful, and I hope you have like an awesome rest of the day. And another thing I'd ask is if you ever are on the page for the podcast and you find that you are enjoying these, the way to let me know that you're enjoying them is to actually rate and review them and subscribe. So I hope you do that and let me know if you are enjoying these and what other, topics about scenarios that you have questions about. You can email me directly, Anna at eLearnerEngaged, and I will talk to you next week. Take care. Bye.
You're listening to the eLearning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Zabramowitz.